2006 Daytona prototype. I bought this probably about 8 years ago, and originally when I saw it, I had the plan of putting a 4-rotor engine in it and then eventually coming up with a body that resembles the 787B. Both of those things didn't happen. The main reason why it didn't happen is because the transaxle on the back of this car is designed for a V8. Now, a rotary, even though it's much smaller dimensionally, the center line of the eccentric shaft is higher than a race V8. So, not the end of the world, just raise the transmission up. The downside to that is the transmission is also a structural member that houses all the suspension components on it. So in order to raise the transmission, you'd have to redo all the suspension mounting points completely. Once that happened, I knew a ton of machining would be involved. It kind of gave up the idea of putting a 4-rotor into this chassis. I decided it'd be best just to put it back to how it was, repaint it, the livery that it was, and reinstall V8. Now, on the livery, this car was originally the Citgo number 11 car, which it didn't get first place at the 24 Hours of Daytona, but it did get second place. And the big, makes it somewhat famous is it was a female driver that got second place at Daytona. So that is the highest place female driver in American history. Is she got second place at Daytona at the 24 Hours.
Here comes the 11 car from second place in the hands of Patrick Pontiac.
Look at the grill opening, it's been damaged. It's got a squeak to the front of it, now might need to be repaired.
His last lap was a 52.3 opposed to Scott Pruitt's 46.9, so maybe he's got a problem.
And he's coming in just over an hour to go. He'll be able to go an hour.
This is a Riley chassis. It's using an X-Track gearbox, which will take all these panels off, and you'll see all this cool stuff, in the flesh. But wheels are monolug, inboard suspension, sequential transmission, obviously, blade sway bars. These were basically, at the end of the 90s, prototype cars were getting crazier and crazier. And so regulators, once they went away, were kind of scared to bring them back in the States because they didn't want the speed to be so high. So they all kind of had a gentleman's agreement to make these, and they set up a whole bunch of rules when they created this. And one of them was they wanted to control the cost, they wanted to make them slower and safer. So to achieve those 3 goals, they mandated that the chassis could only be made of steel, so there's no more carbon tubs, and that's why this is a full tubular steel structure. The car had to have a certain footprint to slow it down. So this big cabin right here, which looks a little ridiculous compared to earlier prototypes, wasn't done to be ugly. It was actually done to slow it down. They're trying to keep it under, I can't remember what the speed threshold was, but I'm pretty sure it was just under 200 miles an hour is what they were going for. To control the cost, everything had to be kind of similar between all the prototypes. So they had the steel structure help save cost. The wheels were kind of a spec size. Dimensions could only get so large. Engine power plants had certain, a lot of regulations on the engine. So this one used an LS based engine. The Porsche car used their flat 6 based engine. And then Ford had the turbo 4-cylinder based engine. So they're all kind of street engine based in these cars. So there was no exotic materials allowed, and most of its construction and the engine had to be relatively low key. So all those combined have made a very successful racing series, and they called them Daytona prototypes. This is a generation 1, and then there was a generation 2, which did some minor changes. Generation 3 kind of went away from that gentleman's agreement, and you saw the bodies shrink back down, the canopies get smaller, the horsepower started going up, the aerodynamics coming back in a big way, so the wings were larger, the ground effects were bigger. So they're kind of starting to go right back to where they were in the 90s, but just nowadays. And then after the Gen 3, I think they just call them DP1s now. They don't even call them Daytona prototype officially, but it is DP still. So that's kind of the quick brief history of these cars, and I was lucky enough to get my hands on one. And really, I learned a whole bunch about it. So this helped develop the RX-7. I kind of studied the suspension geometry, how the control arms were built, and applied a lot of that onto the RX-7. just because these engineers had already done such a fantastic job of making a very durable but fast race car.
It's gonna stay.
Yep. Let's talk about it. So here's underneath. This is the inboard suspension. You can tell that it's been sitting in the back for quite some time because it's got some cobwebs all over it. But these are your giant brake ducts that lead to the brake rotors on each side. These are Coney adjustables. They're not like the top tier. They did have different suspension depending on the race team, but this one was more of a basic, not external reservoir setup. Very stout and simple chassis. It's all square stock steel. The steering rack actually had a power steering column, so while this is manual, it was full power, just electric assist. Hubs are steel to save cost. I have the brakes, they're not on it right now. They use like a 6-piston Alcon. So let's pull off the rear clamshell, take a look at that. And we press that on top of this for time.
Yeah, it's getting repainted, so.
Yep. Perfect balance. Alright, and there's the main event. So this is the X-Track transaxle. And these are outrageously expensive transmissions. I actually met a guy who worked on this particular transmission at X-Track. He's one of the engineers, and I met him at the PRA show. He said these are $75,000 to purchase brand new, and then used easily in the $35,000 range. Why they're so expensive? They're rated to race 24 hours. That's a very big difference compared to any other transmission you're going to find that is street derived or from an aftermarket company. 24 hours is so much more engineering and technology than a transmission that is not designed to go 24 hours. They actually even offer the same model that's not 24-hour rated, and it's almost half the price, to give you an idea of what goes into making a transmission survive that kind of punishment. If you look through history, some of the most famous races at Le Mans are lost and won if a transmission has a failure or not. So the importance of a transmission cannot be stressed enough, especially in a 24-hour situation. It's everything. So that is actually the stress member that we were talking about. You can see the cage tubing is right here for the whole entire tube chassis. You have a bulkhead that bolts on, and then the transmission bolts onto the bulkhead. And here's all your suspension mounting. So the upper and lower suspension mounts are on the transmission itself. And then the front suspension and the front cantilever is actually on the bulkhead. So it's a mix of about 50% of the suspension is mounted onto the trans, 50% is mounted onto the bulkhead. The entire aerodynamic downforce is all put through the transmission entirely. So there's a lot of stress that get put through this unit. It's seeing not only the power from the engine for that long, but also all the aerodynamics and suspension loading for that long. Over here in the side of the chassis, they would have the dry sump tank right over there, which you can kind of see the little cup. And then there's a cooler I just have miscellaneously laid there, but they were water to oil coolers. They had 2 of them, one on each side. Then the V8 would tuck down here nicely. Fuel cell right there behind the driver and in between the engine. So it keeps the center of mass as centralized as possible and as low as possible. The blade bar, this one has a fixed unit on it at the time being, but they did have the adjustable rear, which would have 2 blades. Same with the front. I have the front off at the moment, but it was blade adjustable as well. And then of course these are your heavy duty wing mounts, which little details, even the back of the wing mount is actually profiled to help reduce drag. So it's kind of a neat thing that on a budget series, they still threw in their little spicy aerodynamic components to it. So here's the doors. Latch pull forward. These are a little sticky, but just like that, there's a little air shock in it, and that is the interior, or lack thereof. Large tubs. This is part of the safety thing. Chassis is actually right here, but all this had a side impact, carbon fiber side impact tub. That's part of the safety regulations when they allowed these to come back, is they would take a full hit sideways without anyone getting severely injured. So, firewall right here, seriously heavy, overbuilt roll cage, 1 3/4 inch tubing, square tubing down there. There's a shifter, there's a spare shifter, and here is one of the calipers for the front, so you can see the 6-piston Alcon radial mount. This is all very similar to what's on the RX-7 as well, just the RX-7's a 4-pot, but same radial mount, same kind of technology. This would be from the, late 2000s, or sorry, late 90s, early 2000s will be what these came from. So, of course, every race car, any real race car that's professional, has an air jack system. So you can see the air jack over there. There's one over here. It actually only uses 3. There's 2 in the front and 1 in the rear. And I hooked all these up and they do work. So they would have a little channel to connect all of them at once into the side of the car somewhere, and then you just hook an air hose to it and up it goes. That is the center one, which you can tell it's a little larger. This is a piece that took me forever to find. This is the front pinion shaft for the transmission. So you can see how insanely low that is to the ground. From this point to this point right here is about 3 inches. So that's a very low center line. You definitely have to have a dry sump engine, like a dry sump V8, small stroke V8, nothing large, to be able to fit in there. Okay, so here is the Daytona prototype with the body completely off. This is the first time I've actually seen this car with the body completely off, because when I purchased it, it was, all assembled. And it's got to say, it's pretty cool. It's so tiny. It looks, much larger with the body on it. But once you have it all off, you really see it's not a whole lot to these guys. And this is a pro level race car, but it just shows that you don't need lots and lots of tubing to achieve the torsional rigidity of the chassis and strength that they're looking for. I mean, it is the goal to keep it as light as possible with as much strength and safety. But you can see the transaxle back here. This is a stress member of the chassis. So all the loading goes through the rear wing here for the downforce. Suspension components bolt on, top and bottom. This is part of the problem that I had with wanting to put a rotary in this car. Was in order to move this input shaft up, a couple inches, basically right here on these bulkhead bosses, I would have had to raise it 2 inches as well, which then once that goes up 2 inches, the suspension needs to drop on the mounting points. So this would need a piece remachined, which isn't all that difficult, to drop those 2 mounting points down lower. And these suspension mounting points right here can stay the same. You see the suspension, it doesn't look very durable, but if you talk to people who race and build race cars like professionally, they'll tell you that this car was actually really overbuilt. So they were kind of like tanks. They could take a pounding and keep on going, and because all the suspension components were so heavy. They're a steel upright, fabricated steel upright, steel for where the steering attaches. The control arms are steel. So there's no exotic materials in this whatsoever, and they look really small, but they're actually kind of overkill apparently. Yeah, that's kind of all its neat tricks and everything. You can see the chassis layout a lot more clear with the body off of it, which it's pretty cool. Definitely, I've learned a lot from this car, and I really hope to see it fully together and running, and actually get to drive it before I sell it, because it's just something I've always wanted to experience.